This is a mountain scene reflecting on water. I'm using a full-size diagram. It's about 32 inches long. Using Logic Trace, the first thing I'm going to do is select the 4 points. I'm going to define the 4 corners of the diagram. You can see here where I'm selecting the 4 corners. When I fastened down the diagram to the drawing board, I never realized it was upside down. Doesn't really matter, a trace is a trace. I'll be using the trace command for most of this diagram because the diagram is quite irregular. There's only a couple of spots where there are straight lines. The other thing worth mentioning here is that initial trace, that perimeter of the diagram, that's a long trace. It starts at the top there, goes all the way around to the bottom of the mountains, and right back to where I started. That was a long trace, but it worked out just fine. When I say long trace, the diagram is 32 inches long, so 32 times 2 is 64 inches, so that's about a 64, 62 inch trace. You can see that trace here being completed. The next step here is to start tracing the internal parts. I used the trace command pretty well for the whole diagram. There was a few spots there where there's some straight lines, and I used the line command. Good point to bring out that when you do have the chance to use the line command or the curve fit or the arc, it makes the tracing a lot faster, because when I use the trace command, I actually have to trace each spot on the diagram. It's also worth mentioning here that I save my work frequently. That way, if I make any mistakes, I can just reload that file. I like to mention that I use a red pencil to mark off the spots where I start my trace. It's important to keep track of your starting spot because you don't want to have a crossed vector. So if you come around tracing and you overtrace the spot where you started, that will cause a crossed vector, and that has to be edited out. So it's a lot easier just to mark off with a red pencil where you've started. This shows where I selected the line command. And you can see the line command is very quick. You're only selecting a few points and it creates the tracing. One unique feature is the ability of the program to extend the control window to another device like a cell phone or an iPad. This way you can make your selections right beside you, real close to where you're tracing. The control window is the window on the left-hand side where you're making all your selections with those buttons, the line, tracing, curve fit, or arc. Getting finished up here with the tracing, so the next step is to save that final file. And I'm going to load that file directly into the laser software for the cut. First thing I do when I load that file into the laser software is to run the simulator in that package to see how much time it's going to take to do this cut. It showed it was going to be around 12 to 14 minutes. This barn board really cuts well, makes a nice fine cut. I'm using a 300 watt CO2 laser. It cuts metal, non-metal. I also use about 28 psi of air. That's what makes the cut so fine. I like using that barn board panel because you don't have to paint it or spray it or protect it. You just cut it and your work is done. Here I've removed all the background. We're just looking at the mountains and the lake. Here's how the profile would look in black. I've got the finished product mounted on my wall and it looks good.